The Jerusalem Channel is made with the support of you, our viewers. Thank you for watching.
Who wrote our Bible, and where did the New Testament writers get their ideas from concerning the God of Israel and future expectations? We want to study with you the development of ideas along a biblical timeline. It's a process called eschatology. So how did the church understand the end times of the world as understood by Jesus and the early church? Shalom, I'm Christine Darg. Many teachings of the Bible were revealed progressively, including and perhaps especially teachings concerning the end times, eschatology. Let's study the history of these ideas, starting with the Hebrew Bible, working through the intertestamental writings, and by doing so, we'll be able to better understand the worldview of first century Jews, influencing the writings of Paul and other New Testament writers. One cannot understand the future expectations of the Bible without understanding its history. Eschatology, the study of the last things or end times in the Hebrew Bible, centers on hope, our blessed hope, the hope that God will one day end evil, right all wrongs, and restore the broken relationship between himself and his people and whisk us away to heaven. This hope took shape gradually in Israel's history, often sharpened by many crises. When the Jewish people fell on hard times, faithful Israelites began to expect a decisive future act of God to fulfill his covenant promises. In this first part of our series, we'll journey from the Assyrian invasion under King Sennacherib in the 8th century BC to the conquest of Alexander the Great in 4th century BC. During those turbulent centuries, the seeds of Jewish eschatology began to take shape, the expectation of a divinely ordained climax of history. The prophets, facing national catastrophe and foreign domination, increasingly pointed toward a future day of the Lord when God will judge the wicked and deliver the faithful. By examining this period, we will lay the foundation for understanding later developments in Greek times, the writings of the historian Josephus, and ultimately the eschatological mindset of Jesus himself and the early church in subsequent parts of this series. Before diving in, it's important to recognize what eschatology meant for ancient Israel. It was not idle speculation about the end of the world, but rather a profound trust that God's justice would ultimately prevail. In broad terms, Hebrew eschatology looked forward to the end of sin, end of war, of human infirmity and mortality, a time known only to God. Early glimpses of eschatological hope appeared in the Assyrian and Babylonian eras. It grew during the exile and became more defined under Persian rule, setting the stage for the changes that the Greek conquest would bring. Let's begin in the late 8th century BC with the rise of the Assyrian Empire. Its expansion posed an existential threat to the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. In 722 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed by Assyria, fulfilling dire warnings from the prophets Amos and Hosea. A few decades later, in 701 BC, Judah itself was invaded by Assyria's king Sennacherib. His army ravaged the countryside, capturing 46 fortified Judean towns and deporting thousands. Assyrian records, such as the Taylor Prism, boast of how Sennacherib trapped Hezekiah, the king of Judah, in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage, a vivid confirmation of the biblical account that Jerusalem was besieged. Facing this juggernaut, King Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah responded with remarkable faith. Isaiah urged the king not to surrender, but to trust in the Lord's deliverance, despite overwhelming odds. Hezekiah prayed in the temple for divine help, and a sudden miracle occurred. The Assyrian army was struck by a disaster overnight. The scriptures say an angel of God slew 185,000 soldiers, forcing Sennacherib to withdraw. This astounding deliverance left a deep imprint on Judah's theological outlook. It confirmed that God could intervene in history to save his people, even when hope seemed lost. Isaiah and his contemporaries saw the defeat of Sennacherib as more than just a tactical reprieve. It was a sign of God's sovereignty over the nations. Biblical writers even likened the events of 701 BC to a day of the Lord. In Isaiah 22:5, the prophet describes the chaos of the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem as a day of tumult, trampling, and terror, applying day of the Lord terminology to that calamity. Already by Isaiah's time, Jews could see a disaster as a miniature or foreshadowing of the ultimate day of judgment. In the prophetic mindset, God's judgment on Assyria was a dress rehearsal of sorts for the final judgment upon all arrogant powers. It's important to note that the prophets often spoke about immediate events and ultimate events in the same breath, using the same imagery. Isaiah is a prime example. He foretold that Assyria's flood of invasion would reach up to the neck of Jerusalem, implying the city would almost fall, but not quite. That prophecy was fulfilled in 701 BC, when Jerusalem alone escaped conquest. Yet, in the very next chapters, Isaiah pivots to grand visions of a future beyond the Assyrian threat, a time of messianic peace and worldwide justice. In Isaiah chapter 9, verses 6 to 7, he prophesied the coming of an ideal Davidic king who would usher in an age of righteousness. He wrote, "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and his name will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Prince of Peace. And of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, to establish it with justice and righteousness from now on and forever." This famous passage, likely written against the backdrop of the Assyrian menace, shows how immediate hope blended into ultimate hope, a divinely empowered king and endless peace. In Isaiah's vision, God's rescue of Jerusalem from Sennacherib was not the final act, but a signpost toward a far greater redemption to come under a messianic ruler. Isaiah goes on to describe that messianic age in striking terms. In chapter 11, after Assyria's pride is humbled, a new leader from King David's father Jesse is depicted as arising, a shoot from the stump of Jesse, filled with God's Spirit and bringing about a restored creation, where the wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord. Clearly, the end of the Assyrian threat stirred Isaiah to contemplate nothing less than a new world of peace, as if the relief of Jerusalem was a foretaste of Eden's restoration. This blending of the near and far, the historical and the eschatological, is a hallmark of biblical prophecy. The Assyrian crisis crystallized two key ideas in Jewish eschatology: the day of the Lord as a time when God fights for his people, and the messianic hope of an ideal Davidic king who will bring permanent deliverance and justice. These themes would continue to echo through later centuries as new crises inevitably arose. Despite the reprieve in 701 BC, Judah's sin and political turmoil continued. Just over a century later, a new enemy, Babylon, arose to fulfill the warnings of the prophet Jeremiah. In 586 BC, Jerusalem was conquered by Babylon's king Nebuchadnezzar. The temple was burned to the ground, and the people were exiled. This national catastrophe was even more traumatic than the Assyrian threat had been. The Babylonian exile from 587 to 538 BC has been described as one of the biggest crises of Israel's history. Not only were the people removed from their promised land, but they grappled with what it meant for God's covenant promises. If God's house, the temple, lay in ruins and David's throne was empty, had God's plan failed? This dark question forced the Israelites to radically reshape their hope. In exile, prophets and scribes searched their traditions and revelations for answers. Would the nation survive? What future did God intend for them now? As one scholarly study notes, the exiles developed new ideological and theological perspectives during this period out of sheer necessity. In the ashes of defeat, eschatological hope was refined, becoming more cosmic. In Jeremiah 29, verses 10 to 14, Jeremiah prophesied as Babylon attacked that exile would last 70 years and then God would restore his people. And in Jeremiah 31 to 34, he looked beyond the immediate return to envision a new covenant between God and Israel, written on their hearts so their sins would be forgiven and they would finally be God's faithful people. This promise of a new covenant hinted that the ultimate solution was spiritual renewal, not just political restoration. Ezekiel, a prophet amongst the exiles in Babylon, likewise offered both new hope, and in a famous vision, Ezekiel saw a valley of dry human bones, which at God's command resembled and came back to life. In fact, in chapter 37, God explained to Ezekiel that these dry bones represented the whole house of Israel. God said, I will open your graves and raise you from your graves, O my people, and I will put my spirit within you, and you shall live. The language of national resurrection also planted seeds for a more literal idea that God has power even over physical death, a concept that would fully blossom later. Ezekiel didn't stop there. In chapters 38 to 39, he prophesied the war of Gog and Magog, describing a massive invasion of restored Israel in the last days. God himself will dramatically crush, displaying his glory to the nations. So here we see the holy war motif. God will directly fight a final battle to protect his people. Later prophets will echo and expand on this theme. For example, Zechariah chapter 14 envisions all nations attacking Jerusalem and God intervening to defeat them. And we're seeing this unfold even today. During and after the exile, the scope of eschatological hope broadened. Earlier prophets had spoken of the day of the Lord primarily in terms of judging nations and restoring Israel in a historical sense. Now, writers like Ezekiel began to describe cosmic and supernatural elements, resurrections, and an end to uncleanness. Ezekiel chapter 36 speaks of God giving the people a new heart and spirit, triumphant battles against ultimate foes, and even a restored temple. Ezekiel chapters 40 to 48 outline a perfect new temple and a reordered land. During the exile, communities of Jews in Babylon certainly longed for a return to their land, but their prophets ensured that they looked for more than just a political reversal. They implanted the idea that only when God transforms hearts of the people and decisively defeats evil would the full promises to Israel be realized. Thus, exile sharpened the forward-looking faith of Israel. As one theological study observes, throughout the Hebrew Bible, one finds promises of a better future to come, and in each crisis, those promises grow more far-reaching. In summary, the Babylonian exile fundamentally deepened Israel's eschatology. Stripped of land, king, and temple, the Jews clung to God's promises more tightly than ever. The Jews believed that if they turned back to God, an unprecedented age of blessing would dawn once their chastisement was over. Now let's examine Persian rule and the rise of apocalyptic thought. In 539 BC, Babylon fell to Cyrus the Great of Persia. To the Jewish exiles, this event was nothing short of providential. The Persian king Cyrus issued a decree allowing exiled peoples, including the Jews, to return to their homelands and rebuild their houses of worship. In Isaiah 45, verse 1, the Hebrew Bible remarkably calls Cyrus the Lord's anointed, literally Mashiach, Messiah, crediting him as a chosen instrument of God. To the prophets, Cyrus's victory was God's own act. The day of the Lord against Babylon had arrived, as prophesied. Jews returned to Jerusalem and rebuilt the temple by 515 BC. Yet the reality of the restored community was disappointing compared to the dazzling visions. The second temple was modest. The nation remained a small province under Persian imperial yoke, and many prophetic hopes, such as worldwide peace, David's righteous king, judgment on all Israel's enemies, were not yet realized. This gap between expectation and reality kept the eschatological flame alive. Post-exile prophets such as Haggai and Zechariah encouraged the people to persevere, promising that the latter glory of the temple will be greater than the former, and that God would yet come and dwell in Zion. In Malachi chapter 4, likely the last Hebrew Testament prophet, 5th century BC, he spoke of a coming day burning like an oven to purge the wicked. And Malachi foretold that Elijah will return before the great and terrible day of the Lord. Clearly, even as the Jews lived under Persian rule, they were looking ahead to a greater deliverance, one that would exceed the mere return from Babylon. It was toward the end of Persian rule, or the beginning of Greek rule, that the apocalyptic genre truly blossomed in Jewish literature. The prime example is the book of Daniel. Though set in the context of the Babylonian exile, 6th century BC, many scholars believe Daniel was compiled in its final form during the persecutions of Antiochus IV in the 2nd century BC. However, even if written later, its visions reflect the culmination of hopes that had been developing through the Persian time. Daniel is an apocalyptic text full of symbolic visions, angelic interpretations, and cosmic scope. It essentially provides a prophetic outline of history from the Babylonian Empire through succeeding empires leading up to the end of the age. In Daniel chapter 2, the prophet interprets King Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a great statue made of 4 different metals, which a divine rock shatters to bits. The 4 metals represent 4 kingdoms that will succeed each other, and the rock symbolizes God's kingdom that will finally shatter and replace all worldly powers. Likewise, Daniel chapter 7 records a vision of 4 grotesque beasts from the sea, a lion, a bear, a 4-headed leopard, and a 10-horned monster, symbolizing 4 empires, which are ultimately judged by God's heavenly court and replaced by God's everlasting dominion, given over to one like a son of man who comes on the clouds, the Messiah. The book of Daniel's message is clear. Human empires will rise and fall, be they Babylon, Persia, Greece, or others. But God has an appointed end to his succession. In the end, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, and his kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. So says Daniel 7:27. This explicit plan of world history moving toward a climax is a milestone in Jewish eschatological thought. No longer were prophetic oracles just addressing one nation or one crisis. Now they painted a timeline of the whole age. The 4-kingdom framework in the book of Daniel became hugely influential, and later readers, both Jewish and Christian, will interpret the kingdoms in various ways. Traditionally, they are understood as Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, with Rome being the last empire before God's everlasting kingdom. Daniel asserts God's sovereignty over empires and reassures the faithful that their sufferings under pagan rulers are only temporary. In Daniel's vision, the seemingly invincible empires are but fleeting beasts before the Ancient of Days, That's God's title in Daniel chapter 7, who will judge them. Moreover, in Daniel 7, verses 13 to 14, Daniel introduces the figure of a heavenly deliverer, one like a son of man coming with the clouds to receive the eternal kingdom. This figure, interpreted by Christians as a prophecy of Messiah, of Jesus, shows the growing expectation of a personal Messiah, deliverer in the end of times, Yeshua HaMashiach in Hebrew. Earlier prophets spoke of a Davidic king bringing justice. For example, Isaiah's Prince of Peace. Daniel's vision places that concept in a cosmic, even heavenly context. Finally, Daniel 12, as mentioned, brings in the promise of resurrection and final judgment. The righteous will rise to everlasting life, and the wicked to everlasting shame. Thus, by the end of the Persian period, Jewish eschatology had fully developed core themes that would carry into New Testament times. Themes such as a coming Messianic kingdom, resurrection of the dead, final judgment, and the defeat of evil powers. As the Persian Empire gave way to the Greek Empire, these hopes did not wane. In fact, they took on new urgency. So now let's consider Alexander the Great in Jewish prophecy in 334 to 331 BC. Alexander the Great swept across the Near East, conquering the Persian Empire. For the Jews, who had known Persian rule for 2 centuries, this was another massive upheaval. Remarkably, Jewish tradition tended to fit even this event into their prophetic worldview. Although Alexander himself is not mentioned explicitly in the Hebrew Bible, later readers believed that the Hebrew Scriptures had foreshadowed his advent. The clearest example is again from the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 8 contains a vision of a 2-horned ram trampled by a 1-horned goat. The angelic interpreter identifies the ram as the kings of Media and Persia, and the goat as the king of Greece, with a great horn between its eyes being the first king. This is a transparent reference to Alexander the Great, the first king of the Greek Empire, who overthrew Persia, the ram. The vision even predicts in Daniel chapter 8 that the great horn will be broken at the height of its power, and 4 smaller horns will arise, corresponding neatly to Alexander's untimely death and the division of his empire among his 4 generals. Such prophecies amaze later Jewish readers. Josephus, the 1st century AD Jewish historian, recorded a famous story about Alexander's encounter with the Jews that, while likely legendary, illustrates nevertheless how strongly Jews believed Alexander fulfilled their prophecies. According to Josephus's Antiquities, when Alexander arrived at Jerusalem in 332 BC, the high priest met him and showed him the book of Daniel, specifically the part where Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians. Alexander allegedly interpreted this as referring to himself and was pleased. In the story, Alexander then honors the Jewish God and grants the Jews favorable terms. Whether or not this encounter happened, the tale is instructive. It demonstrates that Jews saw Alexander's conquest through the lens of their sacred writings. To them, world events were not random. God had already revealed the sequence of empires, and Alexander was simply a part of the divine plan moving history toward the ultimate kingdom of God. In a sense, Alexander's victory over Persia was taken as one more step toward the fulfillment of Israel's hope. The Persians, who had been semi-benevolent overlords, gave way to the Greeks, who in time would impose Hellenistic culture and in some cases harsh decrees, as surely happened under the evil Antiochus IV, who was a forerunner and a type of the future Antichrist. The Jewish Maccabean revolt in the 2nd century BC increased apocalyptic expectations, but that's jumping ahead to the next episode. Here in 331 BC, we stand at a pivot. Alexander's empire inaugurated the Hellenistic age, bringing Greek language and ideas into the Near East, including Judea. As we'll explore in a future video, this Greek influence had profound effects on Jewish thought and subsequently Christian thought. But even at the moment of Alexander's conquest, Jewish eschatology was robust and intact. The people still awaited a Messiah, a new Davidic king. They still believed in the coming day of the Lord to judge the wicked oppressors. And now many also held the hope of resurrection and eternal life for the righteous. In fact, it's worth noting that by the time of Alexander's death, 323 BC, the collection of Hebrew prophetic books was largely complete, except perhaps the final form of the book of Daniel. Jews could read Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the 12 minor prophets, and see a comprehensive picture of promised future glory. They saw that after the punishment of exile, prophets such as Zechariah had foretold that the Lord will become king over all the earth, and Jerusalem shall dwell in security, as per Zechariah 14, 9-11. They treasured assurances such as Malachi 4:2, that for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness shall arise with healing in his wings. Even as Greek governors and armies now occupied their world, the Jewish people had an identity and destiny rooted in biblical promises. Thus, Alexander's arrival did not squelch Jewish eschatological hope. If anything, it internationalized it further. The stage was being set for a clash of worldviews, the covenantal, prophetic worldview of the Jews and the philosophical, imperial worldview of the Greeks. A future video will delve into how Hellenistic culture influenced Jewish thought and how the Jews responded. But for our purposes momentarily, we'll conclude with this thought. By 330 BC, the Jewish people had already developed a rich eschatology grounded in their scriptures and experiences. They had endured the Assyrian crisis and seen God's hand of deliverance, sparking visions of a Messianic kingdom. They had suffered the Babylonian exile and learned to yearn for a new covenant and even a new creation. They had lived under Persian rule, during which their expectations of a final judgment, resurrection, and cosmic renewal were refined and amplified, possibly with some inspiration from Persian beliefs, although always adapted to Israel's faith in the one true God. Now, under Greek dominion, those expectations would be tested and interpreted anew. The history of eschatology thus far shows a trajectory from local and national deliverances to an increasingly universal hope. God's promises, in Israel's understanding, expanded from promises of returning to their land and rebuilding a temple to promises of vanquishing evil itself and transforming the world. But for now, we can appreciate how resilient and profound the hope of Israel has been through these centuries. Despite oppression by one empire after another, Israel's prophetic vision only grew in scope. It's a testament to the spiritual insight of Hebrew prophets and sages that their words carried a dual power, speaking to their own times and yet ever straining forward towards the future consummation of God's plan as we see unfolding even today. And as Proverbs 4:18 declares, the light of the righteous shines brighter and brighter until the full day. And so it is with Israel's hope, shining through the dark age of exile and domination, growing clearer as the promised day draws nearer, and Israel has once again been regathered back to our own land. Amen. Well, meanwhile, let's hear from you on social media or through our free Jerusalem Channel mobile app. Follow my articles at substack.com and all our videos at our website, exploits.tv, and Jerusalem Channel YouTube platform. Finally, we invite you to sign up for our weekly email alert called Exploits, based upon Daniel 11:32, declaring that the people who know their God will be strong, not weak, and we're going to accomplish biblical exploits, the works of the Lord in the remaining time before his imminent return. So let's keep contending for the faith and praying prophetically for the peace of Jerusalem. Shalom, I'm Christine Darg. Maranatha.